Hello, so my name's Kevin Wilson and I'm going to talk about mathematical aggregation with heterogeneous groups of experts. So the idea behind this talk is that our aim is to obtain a probability density function f for some unknown quantity theta, and the idea is that this PDF is going to represent our uncertainty about the quantity theta. And of course in a Bayesian analysis then f of theta could be the prior distribution for theta. So if we want to think about a subjective prior distribution, then the way we would obtain this would be to elicit f of theta from an expert in an expert judgment elicitation. And in this context then f would represent the expert's beliefs about theta, what values the expert thought were likely and what values the expert thought were unlikely for theta. But more generally, we may not observe any data and theta might not be a quantity from a model, so we might think about performing an expert judgment elicitation to obtain f of theta for some observable quantity x which we might observe in the future. So in that sense f would be some sort of predictive distribution for the unknown quantity x. So this is quite a general idea. And the example we're going to use throughout this talk today is based on a project to identify cost-effective means of early detection of erosion in embankment dams. And in case you don't know what an embankment dam looks like, there's a low-resolution picture of one at the top of the slide here. And the aim in this project was to aid management of erosion, and in particular come up with an inspection schedule for a set of embankment dams. And the unknowns of interest that were elicited via expert judgment in the way that we talked about on the previous slide were the things at the bottom of this slide here, but included things like prevalence of leakage, prevalence of internal erosion, and rate of deterioration of these dams. And things like internal erosion, you can't find observations on because as soon as you sort of drill into the dam to have a look, you've changed the structure of the dam. So expert judgment was the way to get at these sorts of quantities in this context. And in a project such as this, where there's quite serious decisions to be made, then asking a single expert for their judgments might not be deemed an acceptable thing to do. And instead, what we may want to do is consult multiple experts for their judgments. So I have 4 experts in the illustration on this slide here. And so each of them would give us a probability distribution in the elicitation for our unknown theta. And we could just report all of those back to our decision maker, but we may instead wish to coerce these judgments into a single view, that single blue probability distribution in the center of the slide here. So this can be done via a mathematical rule, which is what I'll be talking about today, or a behavioral method in which we get the experts to try and come to consensus together. But I'll be talking about mathematical rules, and so what mathematical rule could I use to come up with some sort of aggregated probability distribution? Well, we could pool the expert priors. And the most common way that people pool the expert priors is something called a linear pool. And in this case, the aggregated distribution f of theta is just the weighted sum of the individual expert distribution. So fi of theta is the distribution elicited from expert I for theta. And wi are weights, and as long as they sum to 1, then f of theta, the aggregated distribution, is a probability density function. So how might I choose the weights? Well, there's different ways in the literature. We could choose equal weights, assuming no expert is more expert than any other. We could use performance-based weights, and that's really what this talk's about today. Self-assessed weights have been proposed, but of course there's obvious issues with those, and lots of other things have been proposed as well. But let's focus on these performance-based methods. So the most commonly used way in the literature of doing performance-based weighting is called the classical model. And the idea here is that before you ask the expert for their uncertainty about theta, you ask them for their uncertainty about some other quantities called seed questions. And these are quantities that I, as the person doing the elicitation, knows the answer to, but the expert doesn't. So we elicit some quantiles from the expert about those, so a median, maybe a lower quantile below the median, and an upper quantile above the median, and then we score the experts based on how well they do on the seed questions. So in particular, we score them on their informativeness. How wide are their quantiles? Narrower quantiles gives us more information about the likely values of our random variable, our unknown in our analysis. So that would give us a higher informativeness score. And also statistical accuracy, which is a measure of calibration, sort of Meitner-style calibration. The idea here is that if I elicited a 5% quantile from my expert and a 50%, then 5% of the true answers should lie below the expert's 5% quantile, and 45% should lie between their lower 5% quantile and their median. And if we look at the proportion of seed questions lying in these bins, found using these quartiles elicited from the experts, then the ones that most closely match the theoretical proportions get a higher statistical accuracy score. And based on this informative and statistical accuracy scores, we can then give the experts higher weights if they do better and lower weights if they do worse. And that's what the classical model does. But one question about the classical model we might want to ask is, well, whose beliefs do we end up with? If I just take a weighted average of lots of expert priors, I don't really end up with any of their beliefs at the end for the aggregated distribution f of theta. And the answer to this question is to use Bayesian aggregation. And this was first proposed by Morris in 1977. And the idea here is that the person whose beliefs we're going to end up with in the aggregated distribution is called the decision maker, and this person is not an expert. So this, perhaps in the dam example, is the person who's going to choose the inspection schedule for the dams. And the aggregation aims to represent their beliefs. So what do we do? Well, we do a Bayesian analysis. So the decision maker will have a prior before they hear what each of the expert thinks, f0 for our unknown quantity theta. Then we can treat the expert priors as data, and so they're going to form the likelihood and then use Bayes' theorem to update the decision maker's beliefs. And so here's Bayes' theorem here. So the decision maker's posterior, f1 of theta, given the data d, is just a prior multiplied by the likelihood function, and the likelihood function contains each of the expert priors for the quantity theta. And so then the interesting part of a Bayesian aggregation is, how do we form this likelihood function? One recently proposed method is to do it using a hierarchical model, and this was proposed by Hartley and French in 2021. They grouped the experts into a smaller number of groups as part of this hierarchical model. So let's suppose that I have expert I in group G, and they provide me three quantiles. L, a quantile below the median, M, the median, and U, a quantile above the median in my elicitation. Hartley and French then fit a split normal distribution to these three quantiles. So this has three parameters: the mode, MIG, a precision parameter below the mode, and a precision parameter above the mode, because the split normal distribution is just sort of two normal distributions stitched together with a discontinuity at the mode. And then Hartley and French get the aggregated distribution by using a hierarchical structure for each of these three parameters of the split normal distribution. So, for example, for the median, MIG, we assume that this comes from a normal distribution with some mean for group G and some variance for group G. The next level in the hierarchy is the group level. So our group mean, we assume, comes from a normal distribution with some overall mean mu. And then in the bottom level of the hierarchy, we have our overall level. So mu comes from some normal distribution, which would be centered on what the decision maker thought before hearing the expert judgments. To complete this model, we need priors for the variance parameters, and also some similar hierarchies for the other two parameters of the split normal distribution. And then mu, tau L, and tau U, the three parameters at the bottom level of the hierarchy, would then be our aggregated parameters of our aggregated split normal distribution, which we could sample from based on MCMC samples. There's an extra step in the Hartley and French model, and this is based on the fact that experts are typically overconfident. They tend to give intervals which are too narrow, and there's lots of empirical evidence for this. And so the decision maker could choose to take this into account and recalibrate the expert's priors. So if we consider the distance between the upper and lower quantiles provided by expert I, I've suppressed the group label here, then we could recalibrate this. And we could change it to a new distance di star, which is some parameter gamma I multiplied by the original distance. And if experts are overconfident, then gamma I will be larger than 1. So if we give gamma I a prior distribution, a suitable prior would be a gamma prior with parameters A and B, and put this in a hierarchical structure, so define some hyper priors for A and B, well then we can infer gamma based on some seed questions. So if we ask seed questions in the way that we would in the classical model, then that would allow us to infer how overconfident each of our experts are, and then essentially stretch out their priors based on their overconfidence. So this is slightly different to how Hartley and French suggested to do it, but this seems to me to be a reasonable approach to how we might do this. and then essentially we allocate the extra distance between the quantiles equally to the upper quantile and the lower quantile. So there's these two stages in the Hartley and French model. So how might we group the experts? We've got this group level in the hierarchy, but often natural groupings of experts present themselves. So for example, in the DAM study, our experts, we had 11 experts, 7 of them were worked for the consultants, 2 were independent academics, and 2 worked for the owners of the dams. So they would be natural groupings, and if we included this group layer in the hierarchical structure, then that might prevent the larger numbers of consultant staff from dominating the aggregated distribution of the decision maker. So this is a reason for including that grouping layer. And then we would base the aggregation using these groupings, as we showed in the hierarchical structure. Just as a note, Hartley and French didn't use this sort of natural groupings idea. They used automated group selection using sort of clustering methods and Dirichlet processes. But it seems to me that these natural groupings might be actually more effective in general. So let's return to the example and see how this works in practice. So in the DAM study, there are 11 experts and 11 seed questions. So we have 11 questions to which we know the answers. Each expert was asked for their 5%, 50% and 95% quantiles. And the original aggregation was performed using the classical method. So what we're going to do, we're now going to redo the aggregation using this Bayesian hierarchical model. And we're going to look at 4 possibilities. And essentially the two things we're going to change is whether or not we include the group layer in the hierarchy or just an individual layer, and whether we do this recalibration step. And we'll see the effect that each of these two things has. So I've picked out 2 of the seed questions, seed question 8 and seed question 11, so we can see what's going on. So in each of these plots, we've got the 11 expert priors given by the dark blue lines with the dot in the middle. So the dot in the middle is the expert median, and the length of the line goes from their lower quantile, their 5%, up to their upper quantile, their 95%. And on each of these plots, the horizontal dashed line is the true value for that seed question. And what we can see is a lot of the experts aren't really very good. So lots of the expert distributions don't go through the true value when 90% of them should, if their experts are well calibrated. So what we can see here is that the experts really are typically overconfident. So what about the aggregated distributions? Well, the 2 red distributions on the right-hand side are those without the recalibration step, and the 2 light blue ones are with the recalibration step. The first 2 here are without the grouping step, and the second 2 are with the grouping step. And what we see is consistent across the 2 seed questions. The narrowest distribution is the one without recalibration or grouping. The widest is without grouping but with recalibration. And the one at the end, the one with both grouping and recalibration, is somewhere in the middle of those 2. But what we can see in both cases is that all of the aggregated distributions go through the true value, so they seem to be evaluating uncertainty a little bit better than the individual expert priors. Why does the recalibration have so much of an effect? Why are the recalibrated quantiles so much wider? Well, here are the individual recalibrations for our individual experts. So the dark circles and horizontal lines are the 11 original experts, again for these 2 seed questions. And just to the right of each individual expert, I've got a lighter blue one, and that's the recalibrated quantiles for that expert. And we can see that for the majority of the experts, they've had to be recalibrated very far. So far, in fact, that for a lot of the original expert quantiles, you can't actually see the horizontal line because we've had to zoom these plots out so far. So these experts really are very overconfident in general. And what do these aggregated distributions look like? Well, the 11 individual expert split normal distributions are given in grey here, and the 2 red ones are the ones, again, without recalibration. The 2 light blue ones are the ones with recalibration, and the dashed lines also include grouping, and the solid lines don't. What we can see is that all of the aggregated distributions tend to cluster in the place where most of the experts put most of their probability, but they have wider tails or narrower tails depending on whether we do the recalibration and whether we do the grouping. Just for comparison, I've also in dark blue there given an equal weighted decision maker, and you can see, as opposed to all the other methods which are unimodal, this gives essentially a method which would have 11 modes if the expert distributions were all spread out. So some final thoughts. So some quantities might be more suited to some experts than others. So this suggests an extension of the model. So for example, in a medical elicitation, we might have some questions that are more suited to primary versus secondary care physicians. And so a subset of our questions might be suitable to a subset of our experts. And so we could think about extending this hierarchical model to take that into account. Another possible extension or difference to this model might be that we could avoid this split normal step completely, and we could aggregate the quantiles directly rather than inducing this parametric model. So these are things which we could do in the future, but I don't have time for them today. So here's some references for my talk, and thank you for listening.